Once again, Canadian university professors celebrate political violence and find out how Canada is uniquely bad on certain policies on the world stage. Check this out.
So to have people who work at universities calling for more people to be killed with long-range rifles at university, I think we've seen a lot of extremism from universities of late, but this particular type of extremism seems to be resonating more than the others. Even though those students are there, the more conservative you are, the more you are actively withholding your beliefs because you're afraid you'll be sanctioned. There is sort of unchecked extremism on Canadian university campuses. We're Canadians. Nothing ever bad happens here. There's not going to be bad actors. These are things that happen to other countries. We were essentially a petri dish for really dumb ideas. And you can learn from us, and you don't have to kill thousands of your citizens with bad ideas because we've done it first for you. And the Canada I knew 10, 15, 20 years ago has ceased to exist. And I guess the positive note I would say is that it's easy to restore that Canada. Canada isn't done. When you look at Canada's major problems, it's almost all things we've done to ourselves, which very few countries can say that. All we have to do, and maybe it's more difficult than it sounds when to saying in this forum, all we have to do is just stop punching ourselves constantly in the nuts, which is kind of great.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley, and today, again, we have a fascinating guest. Tristin Hopper is an author. He's just published a new book that we'll be talking about, and he's a reporter and columnist for the National Post. He's lived his whole life in Victoria, BC, so it's good to get an opinion from a non-left individual on Canada's West Coast. We spend our time talking about the situation in Canadian universities with respect to the radical left-wingers that exist there. And then we talk about Tristan's new book that was published just this spring, titled Don't Be Canada, How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. And although that sounds like a depressing book, he actually ends on a note of hope. He said the bad things that are happening, we're doing them to ourselves. And the best way to recover is to just stop doing something. And you already heard in the clips how he describes it. We are rich in resources. We have a relatively young country, and there's no reason to expect that we couldn't improve in a fairly short time, he thinks. Once again, thanks for stopping by. It really makes a big difference to like and subscribe, so please just click the button. That's all you have to do. There's no money involved. There's no email notifications that you're going to get, but it makes a big, big difference to this show and to what I can do here. So please go ahead and click that and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment. On with the show. Tristan, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Good to be here.
I wanted to jump into your article that you just published this morning, and then we'll talk about your book as well. Your article today in the National Post is How Canadian Universities Have Become Cheering Sections for Political Violence. And actually, Jason Kenney, the Honorable Jason Kenney, tweeted or posted on X. He said, it's deeply disturbing to see so many corners of Canadian higher education populated by left-wing extremists. And he ends it with, we should ask how these morally stunted loons got hired in the first place, end quote. So tell me about why you wrote this article.
It's interesting. I actually didn't see that Kenney quote, but it's interesting that Kenney is making the comment because you're hearing a lot of whataboutism. Like, well, right-wingers are doing this too. Kenney's interesting because he's had a lot of, so-called far-right people yelling at him in the past 2 years. Death threats, all of the major, from sort of Freedom Convoy types and Freedom Convoy line types. So, it's interesting to hear his statements on that. But that's exactly what the article was about. Canada is experiencing a phenomenon that you're seeing particularly in the United States and parts of the UK. In the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, people going onto their named social media accounts and celebrating it, and just going beyond just I'm glad he's gone, but this is great. This should happen more. Political violence in this particular type of political violence we like. I think this has been particularly shocking even to members of the left. Because you're essentially trumpeting pretty explicit stomach churning. I mean, I didn't sleep particularly well after seeing what happened to Charlie Kirk. So to see sort of name figures seeing that and seeing this as a moment for jubilation. But anyways, it's something that has been noticed in the United States is sort of a disproportionate number of people who have taken to named accounts with their name behind it and openly celebrated this, is that there's a lot of connections to academia. People often work in sort of a teacher role. And that certainly emerged in Canada. If you can look at sort of the most egregious examples we have had of this, about half a dozen have come from academia. So these are professors, associate professors, and I sort of list them in my article. It's not a comprehensive list, but people who said, bullseye. The most notable example being, I think, a U of T professor who said, honestly, shooting is, the least of what you fascist C words deserve. So, I mean, I wrote about this just because it's something I've been covering for a long time. I mean, in the immediate wake of the October 7th terrorist attacks 2 years ago, we also saw this phenomenon in which you had named professors, associate professors, campus organizations, faculty unions coming out and openly endorsing the murder of more than 1,000 Israelis, including people being gunned down at a music festival. So in many cases, it's the same figures. So the people I was reporting on 2 years ago coming out and saying, "Oh, this is awesome," a terrorist attack at a music festival, are also saying, "Hey, this is awesome," some guy being gunned down at a university. I guess it's more egregious in this case because Charlie Kirk was murdered at a university, doing something very university-like, sitting outside, calmly debating people with a microphone. That's why we have universities. That's why they started in the first place. So to have people who work at universities calling for more people to be killed with, long-range rifles at university, I think we've seen a lot of extremism from universities of late, but this particular type of extremism seems to be resonating more than the others.
Yeah. A couple of the quotes you put, Dr. Ruth Marshall from U of T, quote, "Shooting is honestly too good for so many of you fascist," and then C word, end quote. Amelia Rose.
Which I would argue C word is the least offensive part of that statement. Yeah. No, that's interesting because you also look through her tweet history and what she considers fascist. Everybody's fascist. Post media is fascist. So she's saying we should shoot the fascists. Also, I define everything up to and including a Jewish children's summer camp as fascist. So, I mean, we've been seeing this. I'm the National Post. I'm not the Western Standard. I'm not the Rebel. I'm not, particularly extreme right in any of these. But, I mean, we've all seen this. People referring to the National Post as sort of a fascist organization just for taking opinions that they don't agree with. And now to suddenly see many of those same voices saying, actually, we think that violence should be used against people we consider fascists.
Well, just on that word fascism even, I find it actually denigrates the impact of the Holocaust. To put it in the same moral landscape or scale with the Holocaust is a denigration of the Holocaust itself. And so I mean, we could have a whole discussion about fascism. Another quote you put in there, Amelia Rose, UVic, quote, "Good riddance," all in caps. "The woke radical left finally sent someone with good aim," end quote. And then you also comment on the Hamas, the Hamas-led terror attacks, Heidi Matthews, and then the CBC using her afterwards as a legal scholar. So she spoke out in support of Hamas and support of that terrorist attack, and then the CBC uses her as a scholar. So what's going on there?
That is kind of a theme. It's that, I mean, the reason it's happening is because you can be in a high position of power in academia. You can say these just egregious things that I continue to posit are not representative of, sort of the left as a whole. I still maintain that these are extremist positions that I think most people who marked liberal on a ballot would find abhorrent.
Right.
But there's just no consequences. They know they can say these things. I mean, Fred Hahn, who's head of QP Ontario, his reaction to the October 7th terrorist attacks was very explicitly seeing this as an act of resistance, anti-colonial, whatever, that he supported. And he maintains his job. Now, his life did not change in any way. There was no professional consequences. Now, if I did, I don't know, a conservative equivalent. I don't know, just put out a bunch of string of texts saying that Pinochet, pushing people out of helicopters was a great idea. Of course I'm fired. Obviously I'm fired. I think almost anybody in a similar position. But to see in the examples you're citing of people who openly celebrated a terrorist attack. Harsha Walia is also mentioned in that story.
Mhm.
She, former head of the BC Civil Liberties Association, was at a rally co-organized, I do believe, by Samadoun, which is now a listed terror entity. And she explicitly said the Hamas used hang gliders to swoop in on Nova and gun people down as they were dancing. And she explicitly referenced that and praised Hamas's use of hang gliders. So really getting into the details of the terrorist attack. And within weeks of that, she was being feted by an anthropological association. So it's not just that you have these fringe voices operating within the academic fold. It's that they say something fringe and they continue to get speaking engagements. The university will say, oh, okay, well, we don't, align with their particular viewpoints, but they're still allowed to stay on campus, continue saying these things, have control over people in their classes, influence them. And this gets into another point that I wrote about 2 weeks ago, and I also referenced in this most recent story. The Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy did a wide-ranging survey of Canadian university students and asking them, what are your political leanings, and do you often self-censor? And why do you self-censor? And I would say the biggest takeaway from this survey, and you can read it in its entirety, I'm very lazy. I would never do this kind of data analysis. So fortunately, the Aristotle Foundation did it for me. And one thing that really stood out to me was the amount of Canadian university students, at least among the cohort they were able to survey, 38%, so almost 4 in 10, consider themselves either moderate or right-wing, or conservative in some capacity, which surprised me because I think most people, they see the kind of extremism coming out of universities, and you would assume that 90% of students are all just sort of brainwashed, completely on board with the sort of intifada encampments on campus. And that's just not the case. 38% is almost more conservative than the Canadian electorate generally, certainly in some regions. But what this survey also found is that even though those students are there, the more conservative you are, the more you are actively withholding your beliefs because you're afraid you'll be sanctioned. So you're going to get, and this is what they told the survey, they said, I'm not bringing it up in class discussions under any circumstances because I'm going to get a bit worse grade. The professor is going to turn the other students against me and sanction me. Or in worst case scenarios, you are investigated by campus authorities. So you say, I think there's only 2 genders, male and female, and you're put under investigation. This is a violation. These were transphobic comments given, in a university lecture, and, potentially face being kicked out of the university. So, it all funnels into this general character of, yes, there is sort of unchecked extremism on Canadian university campuses, to the point where, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, they do a sort of annual campus freedom index. And they'll often point to a particular speaker who was sort of barred access to a university campus. And I guess the point we're trying to make, and the point that's sort of been made obvious after the Charlie Kirk assassination, as you probably made the case on this podcast, I was not tremendously familiar with Charlie Kirk, actually, before he was killed. But, what you hear from sort of his colleagues is like, although he's associated with the MAGA movement, he was really nice. He was really polite to people who came up. If, the crowd started booing them, he quiet down. This is just an open debate. When a speaker has their engagements canceled on a university campus, or there's massive security concerns, or, there are people picketing and outside, you'll hear this is far right, this is transphobic, this is hateful. And it's very similar to what you're seeing with Charlie Kirk. It's not, it's just a different opinion that maybe you're not used to hearing, and you just sort of defame it with these words, and then you usually get what you want. You're able to shut it down.
Yeah. And then the self-censoring that students learn, especially in professional degrees, we carry that out into our future positions, our policy positions, or for writing policy. You learn very well where the Overton window lies. And even as a as a teacher. So I've been involved in post-grad education in medicine, and you know very clearly what not to say. Even if you believe it
Yeah.
strongly, you do not say that. You can err on the side of the left. That's fine, and people might laugh, but God forbid if you ever err in the other direction, which is a segue now to your book. So I don't want to, we could talk just about your article the whole time. It's fantastic. I'll have a link for it in the show notes, but I want to talk about your book. You just published it this summer, or Southern House did. Don't Be Canada. How one country did everything wrong all at once.
I
Why?
published it in the spring, actually. I think
Okay.
our theory at the theory at Sutherland House is that we published it just before the federal election. And when I was writing this, we were seeing, we can see the polls, people are realizing something is wrong with Canada. I mean, all those sentiments are starting to return now. They're like, oh yeah, there still are 10 cities everywhere and people are being stabbed randomly in the streets. But just before Christmas, as I'm sort of finishing up this book, we're like, oh, this is going to be a bestseller. All these people, because there was a lot of people asking on all sides of the political spectrum saying, I remember these windows not having bars on them. I remember this park not having a tent encampment in it. What happened? And so this was just sort of, whenever a normal person had these particular types of thoughts, they would get in touch with me, their National Post friend, and say, why did this happen? I was in a faculty meeting and we had to do 3 land acknowledgements, and then I had to acknowledge my privilege and say I'm racist. And this is very strange. Or, I was filling out an application for a civil service job, and I had to check a box saying what race I am. You can't. This is Canada. This is outrageous. You shouldn't be allowed to do this. So this book, we thought, we'll put out this book explaining what's wrong with everything, and people will read it and it'll be a bestseller. But then, Trump starts attacking Canada. Everybody, changes their mind, decides this is the greatest country that has ever existed. I think it's true in some cases, but, we can't criticize it at all. Everything's fine. So we're still selling pretty well, but I think I'm the first economic victim of Donald Trump, because I think, if he hadn't started that trade war, I think we would have been much more open to self-criticism, as we are returning to. You can actually track, in terms of how the book is sold, you can sort of track in people's views of their own country. So, okay, Canada needs to be improved. And I wrote it as a Canadian patriot. People say, I wrote a book bashing Canada because I hate this country. I have to be buried here. I have to bury my parents here. So I wrote it because I would like to not live. I see the potential. I know what Canada is capable of, and I'm very intimately familiar with the mistakes we've made. And what's interesting about them is they're almost all mistakes. Like, when you look at Canada's major problems, it's almost all things we've done to ourselves, which very few countries can say that. Usually there's something geographic or an environmental problem that you're up against. But Canada, all we have to do, and maybe it's more difficult than it sounds when to saying in this forum, all we have to do is just stop punching ourselves constantly in the nuts, which is kind of great. If you're Taiwan, if you're Ukraine, if you're any of these countries, I'm sure they would love that. South Korea, if we could trade, a bunch of crazy communists shooting aiming missiles at us for just not screwing up everything all the time, we'd take that in a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I liked what you said in one interview. You said we are uniquely bad, and it reminded me of a comment in a policy book I have just over on my shelf there from several years ago. And they were discussing health policy, actually, and I don't want to talk about healthcare. You talk about it in your book, but one of the comments from the British group was that whatever we do, we have to make sure that we don't craft a policy like they have in Canada, because we want to avoid a, quote, Canada-like result, end quote.
I don't know if they said Canada-like, but there was a whole day of hearings. So the UK was looking at bringing in assisted suicide policy, and they had a whole day of hearings to bring in Canadian experts and sort of learn the failures of the Canadian system and say, well, here's what happens. Here's what happens if almost no checks whatsoever with assisted suicide, and almost immediately your rate of assisted suicide deaths is way higher than you anticipated and climbing each year. And within that, you have all of these crazy fringe cases that they're no longer fringe cases. All of these sort of edge cases and unanticipated cases that at the time Canadians just assumed would never happen. in each of these chapters, I sort of took a Canadian problem, and then I often tried to trace it back to where it started. So, okay, there's everybody gets bail, regardless of how violent they are, with few exceptions. How did we get here? So you just sort of track it down to this particular piece of legislation, this Supreme Court decision, and you trace it. What is the document that started this particular escalator to madness? And what surprised me is in a lot of these cases, May being probably the most prominent example, is that it was often something was passed uncontroversially. So you would have something that we now know had massive unintended consequences for Canada and has completely screwed up civil society, and it's going to take forever to deal with and reverse the consequences. In almost all of these cases, when it was first introduced, with the best of intentions, no one thought it was even particularly controversial. So we're putting through made legislation, and when you read the House of Commons statements, when you read the Supreme Court justices whose decision sort of preceded it, there's almost no warnings of what is to come. It's just, okay, we'll put in assisted suicide and we'll have very low barriers, and I'm sure it'll be fine. We're Canadians. Nothing ever bad happens here. There's not going to be bad actors. There's not going to be some guy working in Veterans Affairs, recommending to combat veterans that they kill themselves. If they ask for a wheelchair ramp or something, these are things that happen to other countries. We are special people here in Canada, and we don't have to plan for them. Which is sort of my grand unified theory of how, and I guess I haven't made the case of how I wrote the book, because on a lot of these issues, I always assumed if we're doing something nutty, there's probably another country doing a nuttier version of that. So I always assumed, okay, we're handing out, free recreational opioids to drug addicts, and then they're all getting diverted onto the black market, and the safer supply is it. Well, if we're doing it, there's probably some hippie country in Europe that is even doing an even worse version of it. That's usually the case. So we have an out-of-control assisted suicide regime. Yeah, but have you seen Belgium? Belgium's even crazier. And it was my realization, in the closer I looked into these issues, in realizing that no. In many of these places, Canada has gone further than absolutely anybody else, to the point where super liberal corners of Europe are looking at Canada and saying, "Oh, that's a bit too far for us." I mean, the most prominent recent example being sort of some of the extremes of gender medicine, so-called gender medicine, as it applies to kids. You've had all across Europe, you had the Cass Review in the UK, medical boards kind of deciding en masse that, prescribing puberty blockers, an affirmation-based approach. So you got a kid comes and says, I don't feel comfortable in my body, boom. Get them on the puberty blockers, have a medicalized system in place to transition them. All of Europe, all at once, basically over the last year, saying this has been a disaster. These are very powerful hormones. They have irreversible effects. The evidence to support it was never there. We got to stop this immediately. At the same time, you had them doing it. Basically, every medical body in Canada said, "Oh, we don't have to listen to the Cass Review. That's just transphobic. They've been taken over by right-wing activists." Stayed a course on the affirmation approach and puberty blockers. So couldn't be a sharper contrast between those, which I get into in the book.
Yeah. So just I want to touch on why this is happening in Canada, but just very quickly, you talk about safe supply, made, physician shortages, housing shortages, immigration, gender ideology, and the bail system. Why did you choose those topics and not other things?
Those things, I picked them because they're uniquely bad in Canada. So in each of those cases, I can make a case that we're not only bad, but in some elements of it, we've reached extremes that no one else has experienced. On medicine, some of our waiting lists for surgeries are worse than any other country in the developed world or in the OECD. On housing affordability, we have the sharpest disconnection between income and the price of a home. So there's no, there's a lot of mistakes that sort of Western countries are making right now. There's no chapter in my book about how we just kind of phoned it in on military spending and our military sucks these days, because everybody did that. Germany did that. France did that. There's sort of a version of that across most of the developed world. But each chapter is, I'm taking something in which Canada did things that no one else did. Which is largely to our detriment. Overdoses. I mean, I think it's still surprising when people learn that we're doing worse on overdose deaths than anywhere else. There's, you can't, with the possible exception of Scotland. So it was also me noticing the way Canada was referenced abroad. So we mentioned sort of a UK panel at the beginning of this interview, pointing out the Canadian-made system as an example of what not to avoid. I kept seeing that coming up. So there would be an issue, on housing affordability. Well, at least we're not as bad as Canada. We can avoid Canada's mistakes on issues, sort of harm reduction. You can sort of point to the Canadian example. So on a variety of things all at once, we became an example of what not to do, or we should be an example of what not to do. I would urge, non-Canadians to buy this book because it is a great example. We were essentially a petri dish for really dumb ideas, and you can learn from us. And you don't have to kill thousands of your citizens with bad ideas because we've done it first for you.
So the data and the policy issues, absolutely tons to learn there. Very exciting stuff. But I thought you had a brilliant insight. You say that we're a high trust society, and that translates into a high trust for government. So you said we assume that we're immune from bad policy. We're generally have done very well in the long run. We're a very peaceful, well-run country. I'm wondering if those assumptions are changing. Is that a boomer bias, or is that just a Canadian thing?
Oh, I think my sort of grand unified theory, which I didn't have going into it. I just thought, why is everything so bad all of a sudden? And then the more I researched, realizing the extent, I'd say, the most shocking part of researching the book and of reading the book is of realizing that a lot of these weird things that happened, a shop teacher showing up to work with the giant prosthetic breasts, these aren't so much anomalies. When you actually look into the issue, you realize that no, there's a whole systemic structure that supports these things and endorses them. These are not weird anomalies. These are expected outcomes of systems slowly being broken over time. And I sort of track what particular policies cause those to happen and when and for what reason. But my grand unified theory was that things were so good for so long in Canada that we just didn't have any defenses against bad ideas. So to the point where, as I mentioned, you can sort of look at a Hansard when we're discussing a very hot button issue, whether the state should legalize doctor-assisted suicide. In most other countries that did this, there was a lot of, hand-wringing, a lot of, people warning that this is quite a serious thing to undertake, and you should put proper checks in place and, understand the gravity of what you're doing. And in Canada, we just thought, well, things mostly work out for us. There's a Great Recession in 2008, and Canada is generally spared the worst of it. We ran into a massive debt crisis in the mid-1990s, and the government just sort of, buckled down and fixed it, and we we dove out of that in 3-4 years. So I don't think Canadians are irrational to assume that things will just kind of work themselves out, and we just sort of assume that was the natural state of things, rather than the result of decades of good government. So we just sort of got complacent with things being well run, and in that complacency, we just threw away all of these systems that were holding it together. Immigration being sort of the most prominent recent example. I think there's a lot of people who are realizing we just assumed there was something magical about Canada that allowed us to have a high immigration society where people would come here, integrate, love Canada. The Canadian view of immigration is unlike almost anywhere on earth. Until very recently, there was really no mainstream anti-immigration bias. You could go into the most conservative corner of Alberta, a place where in the U.S. equivalent, there would be a lot of animosity towards immigration, and you just had people, the only immigrants they'd ever met were hardworking, loved Canada, had been screened to come into Canada. So I think a lot of people are realizing that this wasn't a natural state of affairs. This is because we had a very well-managed points-based immigration system that, also due to geographic factors, was able to keep out a more toxic element, or didn't overwhelm existing systems So because we were able to sort of manage it correctly, you didn't have a lot of the frictions with immigration that existed in other countries. Now, we took that as license to, it's essentially like you've got a mental illness and you take the drugs and you feel better, so you stop taking the drugs and then you just get crazy again. So we as a society just decided, okay, everything's fine, crime's low, immigration animosity is, the economy just keeps getting better, houses are affordable, all of these things that made that a case, let's just get rid of them because we don't need them anymore. And then one by one, all those problems come back in worse than anywhere else.
Yeah. So you've said a couple times that you spent a lot of time digging in to find what was, going back, looking behind us, what actually started this. And I've heard you say in another place, you said the seeds were already there. And you had an interesting take, again, in another interview that you gave, where you said, actually, yes, Justin Trudeau did a bad job, but he was actually acting on some structures that were already in place. And so you've just mentioned now about something that's well managed or something that's poorly managed. So I'm wondering if your reflections on Justin Trudeau's term have more to do with those seeds that you've mentioned, some of the weaknesses that we took for granted, or is it more to do with the fact that he was a bad manager?
Oh, I certainly was a bad manager, but yeah, I mean, very few of the bad ideas that I cover in the book probably none actually were invented by Justin Trudeau. So I'm much more inclined to see him as sort of a symptom of this overall problem. I mean, we did elect him 3 times. In each case, as I'm sort of tracking these ideas back to where they originated, almost all of them predate Justin Trudeau. Or in some cases, he had very little control over them. So a lot of these bad ideas originated as Supreme Court decisions. Maid being a great example. And so I would say, he just sort of took things that were already, trends that were already underway, and there was just no pushback against it. Just sort of.
And so the.
Go on.
So no pushback. And another comment you've made, again, elsewhere, is that in other countries, some of the things that have happened in Canada would have been major scandals, whether it's putting men into women's prisons, trans men or trans women males into female prisons. The issue with puberty blockers, you just mentioned the Cass report. What is it about Canada? We've mentioned the high trust, perhaps it's that, but even if we don't trust our government, certainly you see people criticizing politicians a lot more now, we still aren't of a nature to rise up and protest. So is that a Canadian thing, or is it because we don't care?
I've noticed it most dramatically when it comes to crime. We'll have almost every day now, we'll have some shocking crime, shocking preventable crime. So someone on bail who would obtain early release, there was multiple incidents in which you had a clearly dangerous person who should have, by all rights, been kept in the system, was let out anyway, and now a child is dead. A toddler has been sexually assaulted to the point of hospitalization. I mean, as we're speaking, this was a repeat offender, had been released for a prior sexual assault against a child, gets a few months in prison, early release, and breaks into a home and sexually assaults a toddler to the point of hospitalization while the toddler's parents are in the next room. So just horrific. I mean, not too long ago, this would have been sort of shocking for months. And now something like this is happening every couple of days. And I've noticed it's very hard for Canadians to sort of rally around these. I mean, something like this will happen, and there's no legislation, there's no sort of vigil movement in relation to it. I mean, there's a case I cover that happened in Edmonton. This was a violent individual, kept attacking random children. So before the eventual incident, was just on Edmonton public transit and just started attacking, very large man, just started attacking a child on transit. And for that, light charges, back on the street within a few weeks. This offender eventually just started randomly attacked a mother and child outside of school, stabbing them to death in full view of the school. So this kind of case it's baffling that you'd think, how come we don't know the names of these children? How come there wasn't legislation named after them? How come this didn't become a defining moment in Canada? And the police at the time saying this is just such an obvious failure of the system, and we see this regular, where someone was dangerous, had indicated they were dangerous, and they just kept getting let out. And it was just a matter of time before this happened. We knew this was happening. This person was known to police, and we had no power. We just had to helplessly watch and wait for it to occur. And yet, there's just no sort of mainstream. I mean, maybe that'll change, but I think Canadians are just married to this idea that there are certain things that do not happen in Canada. And it doesn't matter how often these things actually start to happen in Canada. It can be months or even years before they'll even recognize that. I mean, we'll see below any of these crime stories, some horrific crime story will happen. And you just go into the internet comments, whether this is Reddit or on the original news story, and you'll have the top comment will be, "Oh, this is awful. I hope they throw the book at this person and they make an example out of them." And I just think that doesn't happen. You're describing a fictional situation. You've watched too much TV. You're paying too much. You think we're the U.S. justice system, but if you follow any of these cases, there is never a case of someone getting the book thrown at them. I mean, you can randomly attack someone on the streets, and the average case is you're going to be free within 5 to 10 years, if not less. Either they're going to downgrade it for murder, and it's going to be a manslaughter charge. I mean, again, this just happened in Edmonton. This was an Indigenous girl who had been murdered and sort of stuffed in a duffel bag. A horrific crime against a child. And I think the Crown accepted a plea deal for manslaughter, which means the killer will be out within 5-10 years. So I guess in writing this book and sort of the case I make, when I receive pushback and people say, "Why are you criticizing this country that gave you everything? You hate Canada," is I'm saying the one thing that is most causing these things to happen within Canada is the fact that we have no imagination for the fact that they can happen in Canada. So, we just have a whole category of things that never happen in Canada. And because of that, there's a whole category of things now that only happen in Canada. Just because, whether it's crime, whether it's sort of the incidents you mentioned, whether it's just the, massive proliferation of hate rallies on the streets. So, anti-Israel protests, which men in masks, calling for intifada, calling for violence, wearing open terrorist iconography. And what do politicians say when this happens? They say, this is not who we are as Canadians. Well, what you should start saying is, this is who we are as Canadians. This is now a regular thing. The people who do this kind of thing, feel welcome. There's no friction against them doing it in Canada. So you can't fix it until you acknowledge that you have a problem. So when I think of people who have been in touch with me, or sort of a lot of the figures sort of in this book started out as someone who had a picture of Canada was a certain way in their head. And it wasn't until they were blindsided by, some negative interaction with the criminal justice system, a negative interaction with healthcare system, negative interaction with whatever, that they realized, oh, something horrible has happened. And the Canada I knew 10, 15, 20 years ago has ceased to exist. And I guess the positive note I would say is that it's easy to restore that Canada. Canada isn't done. I think that's a foolish statement to make. But you can't fix your addiction before you acknowledge you have a problem.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring this to ground by talking about whether there's a shift in the minds of people. But just before we leave the legal system, is it the fault of activist judges, or are judges having their hands tied by legislation? And I think you mentioned Bill C-75. I may have that completely wrong. Are there certain guardrails or roadblocks that force judges to be putting certain people out on the street?
So in the case of Bill C-75 specifically, I mean, that brought in pretty hard lines on bail, and it was discouraging. And it also brought on something that we've been flirting with in Canada for quite a while, going all the way back to the 1990s, the idea that you should get differential treatment by the criminal justice system based on your identity. So, I mean, glad you reforms brought in the 1990s. The idea that an Indigenous offender, before they're sentenced, commissioned court report to sort of get into, did they have grandparents who went to residential school? Did they have ADHD when they were going to school? Did they have a substance abuse problem? And that should sort of inform a lighter sentence. And there's any number of cases in which a dangerous person did get out because of a sort of glad you informed sentence and continued to hurt more people. So yes, I mean, we do have straight up activist judges who are issuing decisions that have no grounding in reality, even from the Supreme Court. I mean, the sort of example I would point to is the Bissonnette case. When you actually read the reasoning, so this was Alexander Bissonnette, this is 6-7 years. This is just a white supremacist goes into a mosque, just opens fire on anybody. Or so I think it was 6 dead in a house of worship. And so he's sentenced under a conservative bill that changed it so that if you've murdered multiple people, what used to happen is you would serve a concurrent sentence. So you kill 50 people, and you just serve the minimum sentence of 25 years, all at the same time for the 50. So you're up for parole after 25 years, regardless of how many people you killed. So the conservative brought in a measure which said, no, if you kill multiple people, it's 25 years, then another 25 years, then another 25 years. No. So if you kill 6 people, you're at 150 years, so you're going to die in prison. So we don't have to worry about you if you've killed 6 people. And the Supreme Court overturns this. And when you look at the reasoning, and they overturn it specifically for Bissonnette, but now all the other murderers also can get parole as a result of this decision. Is they said, and I quote it directly in the book, they say Canadians would lose faith in the justice system if even our most severe criminals were not given a chance at bail. I mean, this was justified on the idea that if we cannot offer parole at some point to a guy who opened fire in a mosque, Canadians are going to lose trust in the justice system, which is just insane. I mean, if you look at any poll data, you speak to any normal person, what's causing us to lose faith in the justice system is the exact opposite. I mean, I put out a poll. I think it's in the book. I think it's in other reporting. When you ask Canadians, what would you do with Alexandre Bissonnette, a guy who just, white supremacists who opened fire in a mosque? The majority opinion, and it's not even close, is execute him. So for the judges to say, okay, we think Canadian opinion is point, and the fact that they would cite public opinion, and the Supreme Court does this a lot, which is not their job. They're supposed to cite the law. The fact that they would cite public opinion and have public opinion so divorced from reality, would show that we've allowed judges to take activist positions, and often they won't even realize they're taking an activist position. I think the current Supreme Court justice, he'll talk about that he'll express his pride that the Canadian court has been able to sort of keep in touch with various social trends in Canada. And I would argue that's not true. That is true when you work as a judge and you live in a bubble and you haven't ridden a transit bus since the 1980s. But yeah, you have elite institutions that are increasingly out of touch with any semblance of reality.
Yeah. So just before you have to run, we are aware of a realignment within conservative politics. Young people are voting for or identifying as conservative more than ever. And yet conservatism from coast to coast is very different in Canada. Alberta is different from Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, etc. You've lived on Canada's so-called left coast your whole life. What does conservatism look like out there? And do you see people shifting in Victoria, Vancouver, BC, to a more right-of-center perspective politically?
I think so, yeah. People don't like being stabbed. They don't like seeing their downtown cores become just measurably less safe. So, I mean, during the most recent federal election, I mean, we had some pretty notable flipped seats. So I'm forgetting Errington's riding, but I think that was a flipped NDP riding. I think we had 2 or 3 flipped NDP ridings going directly to conservative ridings. So I would urge people to remember that it's not so much someone's partisan sympathies. So I think people get stuck in the trap of, they look at, I mean, I saw in Victoria, after the most recent provincial election, probably the one riding that's seen the most visible decay. So just, the highest rise in crime and whatever. that saw one of the lowest shares for the BC Conservatives and one of the highest shares for the status quo. So it's easy to look at those results and say, well, the people want to live in ridings just, filled with crime and whatever. So yeah, it's easy to get sort of doomery and assume that, this is what the people want. But I guess my experience of living on the West Coast is that, you could still have people who react negatively to labels. If you shove a Pierre Poilievre pamphlet in their face, they're going to react negatively to that because a conservative in 1982, being homophobic to them or whatever.
Okay.
But people do like safe communities. You are seeing people considered, pretty left-wing, advocating for, we need to take dangerously mentally ill people and institutionalize them. We can't just have them roaming free. So I think there's any number of issues, regardless of which government is in place. Even if you're not getting your preferred government, you can get movements on some of these issues just by making people aware of them. I think a lot of our problems, so more problems than you would think, will start to go away if there's just minor amounts of friction against it. So, people will say, I go into my public library and there's like more trans flags than Canadian flags. What has happened to the public library? Well, have you politely brought this up with anybody at the library? Obviously, if you go in with your, MAGA hat and start yelling at them, it's not going to work. But have you sent a letter to the library saying, well, by the way, I'm wondering why this flag is here. This seems to be strange. If you can sort of politely and calmly explain why a normal person would find it strange that a library is bedecked top to bottom with trans flags 12 months a year. Yeah. You can cause a library manager, known as the most, brave of people, to, potentially back off. So that gets into the other thing of why Canada has been so susceptible to this. There's no friction. You can have a judge, a person in a position of power, and just push very radical positions one after the other, and no one steps up to stop them. And it doesn't take much. There's judges. If there's, I have reason to believe. I've written several articles about why the Supreme Court makes dumb decisions. I have reason to believe that me, a guy working out of his basement, writing 2 or 3 articles about dumb decisions in the Supreme Court, I have reason to believe this is personally grading the Supreme Court and they really don't like these particular articles. And it's possible the next time they're thinking of making a dumb decision, they will have second thoughts about that. So even moderate amounts of friction to a functionary, to a justice, to a bureaucrat, can push them towards making maybe not the right decision, but a less insane decision.
Yeah, brilliant. So write letters. I would also say go and buy Tristan's book. So buying books, I believe now, is a political act. It's a way to send a message, and publishers publish what sells. Publishers want books that sell well. You have to go and buy Tristan's book. Don't be Canada, How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. Tristan, thank you for making the time today. Your ability to write comedic tweets or posts on X is just brilliant. So I encourage people to follow you there. What's your Twitter handle again?
Oh, it's just my name. I was an early adopter. It's Tristin Hopper, TristinHopper.
Perfect. And from there, people can get links to your articles, and I'll put a link to buy your book in the show notes. Thanks again. I really appreciate this, and I look forward to what you say next.
Anytime. Thank you.